How's it going, good people? My name's Pedro, and today we're going to be looking at a not so small form factor PC from the brand Silverstone. Now specifically, this case is called the LD03-AF, and poor naming scheme aside, this is a pretty interesting case to have a look at. It sports 3 tempered glass side panels, compatibility for almost any sort of PC hardware you want to throw in it, and it all comes in at under about 150 Australian dollars or $100 US. Now, a quick thing to note before we jump into it, this case actually isn't for myself. This is for a very close friend of mine who's been using one of my older Silverstone Raven cases, and I think it was about time for him to sort of pick up his own ITX case. Now, as per usual, there'll be timestamps down in the description, so if you want to jump ahead to anything, definitely feel free, but without further ado, let's get into it. So the first key category we're going to look into for the LD03 will be the build quality, and right out of the gate, the LD03 has a tempered glass, plastic and aluminium build for the entire case. So 3 of the 4 sides on this case are all made out of tempered glass, so this gives you a really good visibility when looking into the case to sort of admire all the expensive components that you're putting into your ITX PC. The top and bottom of the case is made out of plastic, so this is mostly to vent air either into the case from the bottom and out the air through the top, and the top sort of shroud or cover for the case ends up being used to sort of angle all of your cables out towards the back of the case, so that way you get this really clean and refined looking aesthetic. And then the actual frame of the body itself is all made out of sandblasted aluminium, and this really helps give a bit of structure to the case itself, because while the tempered glass does add some structural integrity, this aluminium really helps just give a little bit of weight to the case and giving a overall hefty feel to the entire PC altogether. Now, one thing that I can comfortably confirm here is that the plastic and the aluminium all have a similar shade of black. There's no sort of patchiness on any of the aluminium side panels, so this is really good to see. There's nothing I hate more than getting a brand new case, having a look at it, and then noticing that all of the colors are wrong, or that it's not even in the sandblasting, and that the plastic and the actual metal aspects of the case itself don't really match up, which overall just sort of bring down the aesthetics of the case altogether. Now, speaking of aesthetics on the LD03, the overall design language that's used for this case itself is a very modern and angular design cues. So this means that it'll definitely have that angular sort of look, and it's going for that very striking edge modern aesthetic that I guess a lot of people like, and Silverstone has really been sort of leading into that for the last couple of years. So now we've looked at the design and build quality of the LD03, so let's transition from that into the actual features that come on this $100 PC case. To start with the specs of the case itself, the LD03 sports 220mm fans, and both of these fans are 25mm in thickness, which is really good because it really helps sort of provide a solid amount of airflow coming into the case itself. Along with that as well, the LD03 can sport any sort of ITX or DTX motherboards at all, so whether it would be one of the classic ITX motherboards, or if you have one of the larger DTX motherboards, which is the same size as the ITX motherboards, it just has an extra, I believe, 20mm down the bottom. Now, when it comes to GPUs in the LD03, this case can comfortably fit any full-size GPU you can throw at it, so long as it's under 310mm in length and takes up about 2.5 slots in width. So this means most RTX 3080s, 3090s, and any of the 20 series cards will comfortably fit in this case without any sort of issues or worries about compatibility at all. Moving on from GPUs themselves, the case has support for only SFX and SFX-L power supplies. This is what I found a little odd in the design decisions of the case itself. From building in the case, I definitely thought there would be enough space to fit a full-size ATX power supply, but maybe it was a weight concern, or they didn't want to sort of rejig the brackets or the tooling that they've had for this case. So yeah, I guess you can only really use your SFX or SFX-L power supplies. I don't really think this is going to be too much of a worry for most people, because if you are building a smaller ITX form factor PC, you most likely will be using a smaller SFX or SFX-L power supply. And when it comes to wattage on these power supplies, I don't think anyone really has anything to be concerned. With most SFX ITX and SFX-L power supplies, easily being able to power a high-end CPU and a RTX 3080 or 3090 without really breaking a sweat. Now, when it comes to the layout of the LD03, the case is made up of 3 tempered glass side panels on all 3 front-facing sides of the case, and traditionally I'd be very worried about the airflow in a situation like this, mostly because when it comes to having airflow in a case with so much glass and such little actual ventilation for air to flow in and out, it can definitely be a concern for components like the GPU, mostly because it requires such a lot of air to be able to cool a 300 watt graphics card in the case of the RTX 3080 and 3090. Lucky to say, due to the actual layout and airflow considerations for the LD03, this is not a worry at all, with the case comfortably being able to support full-length graphics cards without having any sort of detriment to either thermals or noise, mostly because of these 2 massive 120mm fans that basically pull air in from the bottom and spit it out right at the top. So now, speaking of the fans on the case, there are 2 specific dust filters that are included with the LD03. The first one sits on the bottom of the case, and that is for air flowing in from the bottom into the actual case itself. There's also a dust filter on the back of the case as well. This is used specifically for that SFX power supply, so that way all of the air that's being pulled in via the power supply is all clean and is filtered as well to stop any sort of dust or pet hair at all flowing into the case. Now, moving on from the actual features from the LD03, let's talk a little bit on what it's actually like to put an actual PC into this case itself, because I guess all of these features are great, but if you can't have a pleasant building experience in this case, is there really much of a point in picking up the LD03 at all? Now, it's safe to say that building in this case was enjoyable and straightforward enough, but one thing I did find a little odd about the LD03 is that there is a specific order that you need to follow when putting in components into the case itself. I really didn't expect that a specific procedure would need to be followed, where you would have to put your motherboard in, then the power supply, then the radiators, and then the graphics card in at the end, which I found a little counterintuitive because you can build on cases that are much smaller than the LD03, which really help give you that sort of flexibility to build in whatever order you want. For example, building in something like the K55, which we reviewed, which, mind you, is a case of AliExpress, which specifically allows you to build in whatever sort of order you want, whether you want to put in the graphics card first and then the motherboard after, or the power supply in first. You really have that flexibility to build in other cases in whatever real order you want. Whereas the LD03, you have to follow a very strict routine in terms of how things are placed in the case. Or you'll end up in the situation that I was, where you'd be putting things in like the radiator, only to have to take it out to slot in the power supply, to put the radiator back in, to then put the motherboard in, and then finally the GPU. I guess to save yourself the headache, I'd say start off by just putting in the motherboard and putting in the power supply into the case itself, and you should be fine. Now, a small thing to note when it comes to building in the case itself, like I mentioned before, there are 2 120mm fans that are included with the LD03, and one thing I found a little odd, especially for an ITX case itself, is that there was no sort of fan splitter included. So you could potentially be in a situation where your mini ITX motherboard could only have one specific chassis fan, but you would have 2 cables for 2 separate fans from the case itself. This is not a big thing or a deal breaker at all, but it would be really good to see at least a Y splitter in the box itself, so that way you could have both chassis fans hooked up to the motherboard itself. And I also feel at this price point of about 100 US or 150 Australian dollars, you really would be expecting at least some sort of fan controller or some way to at least be able to fit all of the fans on the case and being able to plug them all into your motherboard. Like I said, it's not really a deal breaker, but it's something to note for anyone looking to build into this case itself. Definitely make sure you pick up a Y splitter, or at least check that you have 2 chassis fan headers on your motherboard itself. Now, apart from the minor gripes that I mentioned just before, I guess there were no real issues with building in this case at all. everything managed to fit together properly. There were no sort of compatibility issues or clearance issues at all in the case. There was no sort of bending or pushing or mangling of the case to fit everything in. Everything sort of just worked, and I think that's one of the really good things with going with a well-known brand like Silverstone. They have a lot of experience when it comes to building cases in this space, and specifically the LD03 is not an outlier from that statement at all. It is a straightforward and easy case to build in, and there was no real issues with the actual build itself in the LD03. Now, to wrap up my overall experiences with the LD03 from Silverstone, this is a very interesting case to pick up, mostly because if you are a fan of that very modern and that very angular sort of design on your case, you really won't be disappointed with the LD03. I think if you add a couple of things like some tasteful RGB into the case, or having components that have some sort of illumination and you color theme it, I think this case can really stand out from the crowd and really look like a very unique and very custom build that anyone can put together. It comes in at a very affordable price point, and whilst it's not the cheapest sort of case you can pick up, it definitely is from a reputable brand, and it also has a lot of affordances that you won't find on some other cases, such as the integrity, having very nice tempered glass and tinted side panels, and along with that as well, you get a lot of compatibility when it comes to being able to put whatever hardware you want into this case without really worrying. So I guess if you were on the fence about picking one up, I definitely think go ahead and pick up the LD03 from Silverstone. You definitely won't be disappointed in your purchase. Alright guys, I guess that'll wrap up my thoughts on the LD03 from Silverstone. If you like this video, definitely hit that like button, get subscribed for more content, and if you were wanting to check out another video, I'm sure something will be popping up on your screen around now. Until I talk to you next time guys, take it easy.